central? What is the role of other humans in our lives? What's the importance of cohesion? This is something you've talked about. So Yaron said that the beauty of the founding documents is that they create a cohesive union that protects the individual freedoms. But you have spoken about the value of the union, the common welfare, the cohesion in itself. So can you maybe elaborate on what is the role of cohesion and the collective, not to use that term, but multiple humans together, connected in the human condition?
Sure. I keep getting the feeling that Yaron and I are actually having a disagreement about empirical reality, because I think that enlightenment rationalist political thought features the individual, it features the state. There isn't really a nation other than the nation. The people is, as a collective, is created by the state, and when the state disappears, then the collective disappears. Now, I think that when conservatives of all stripes look at this kind of thinking, that there's the individuals and then there's the state, and there really isn't anything else. When they look at that, they say, even before you get to consequences, it's a terrible theory, because when we try to understand any field of inquiry, any domain, any subject area, when we try to understand it, we try to come up with a small number of concepts and of relations among the concepts, which is supposed to be able to explain, to illuminate as much as possible the important things that are taking place in the domain. And conservatives look at this, individuals and the state, and they say, you're missing most of what's going on in politics, also in personal human relations as well. But it just doesn't look like a description of human beings. It looks like a completely artificial thing. And then conservatives say, well, look, once you adopt this artificial thing, then the consequences are horrific, because you're not describing reality. So a conservative reality begins with an empirical view of what are human beings like. And the first thing you notice about human beings, or at least the first thing I think conservatives notice, is that they're sticky, is that they clump, they turn into groups. And you take any arbitrary collection of human beings and set them to a task, or even just leave them alone, and they quickly form into groups, and those groups are always structured as hierarchies. There's this competition within the hierarchy, who's going to be the leader, who's going to be number two. But there, everywhere you look in human societies, universally, there are groups. The groups compete, and they're structured internally as hierarchies, and then there are internal competitions for who leads the different groups. And when we think about scientific explanation, we allow that there are different levels of explanation. That a macroscopic object like a table, it doesn't have properties that can be directly derived from the properties of the atoms or the molecules or the microfibers that make up the table. And that's understood, that there's what academic philosophers call emergent properties, that when you get up to the level of the table, it has properties like that you can't put your fist through it, which you can't necessarily know just by looking at the atoms alone. And I think conservatives say the same thing is true for political theory, for social theory, that looking at an individual human being and thinking about what does that individual human being need, which Yaron does very eloquently in his writing. But that doesn't tell you what the characteristics are of this hierarchically structured group. As soon as you have that, it has its own qualities. So an example, the question of what holds these groups together. And we need to answer that question. I try to answer it by saying there's such a thing as mutual loyalty. Mutual loyalty is shorthand for human beings. Individuals have the capacity to include another individual within their self, within their conception of their self. When two people do it, it creates a bond, like a bond between two atoms creates a molecule. That doesn't mean that they lose their individuality. Within the group, they may still continue competing with one another. But that doesn't mean that there isn't, in reality, a bond. And that real bond is the stuff of which political events and political history are made, is the coming together, the cohesion, and the dissolution of these bonded loyalty groups. That's the reality of politics. And so when I hear these discussions about individuals in the state, I feel like we're missing most of the reality. And in order to understand the political reality, we need to understand what makes human beings coherent to groups, what makes them dissolve, what makes the groups come apart and end up creating civil wars and that kind of thing. I think we also need to know what, in practice, rival groups do come together and bond. I mean, basically, when we think about democratic society, we're talking about different groups. We can call them tribes, or you can come up with a different name, but the different tribal groupings with different views, they come together to form a nation, and they're able to do that, even though often they hate each other. Like we were talking about the American Revolution, and often they hate each other, and nevertheless they're able to come together. Why? How? And that leads us into questions like, how does honor, the giving of honor by one group to another, how does that increase the mutual loyalty between groups that are still competing with one another? All of these questions, I think we have to answer them in order to be able to talk about politics. And I think the first reason why one should approach politics as a conservative rather than as an individualist is because it gives us these theoretical tools to be able to talk about reality, which we don't have as long as we keep within the individualist framework.
As you're talking, the metaphor that's popping up in my mind, and this is also something that bothers me with theoretical physics. The metaphor is, there's some sense in which there's things called theories of everything. We try to describe the basic laws of physics, how they interact together, and once you do, you have a sense that you understand all of reality. In a sense, you do, and that to me, that to me is understanding the individual, like how the individual behaves in this world. But then you're saying that you're also forgetting chemistry, biology, how all of that actually comes together, the stickiness, stickiness of molecules and how they build different systems, and some systems can kill each other, some systems can flourish, some can make pancakes and bananas, and some can make poison and all those kinds of things, and we need to consider the full stack of things that are constructed from the fundamental basics. I guess you're saying that no, you're just like the theoretical physicist. It all starts at like you need to preserve the fundamentals of reality, which is the individual, like the basic atom of human society is the individual.
So yes, so the basic unit, the basic moral unit, the basic ethical unit in society is the individual. And yeah, of course we form groups. And you can't understand history unless you understand group formation and group motivation, and I have a view about what kind of groups should be formed. And politically, from a political perspective, voluntary ones in which we join when we want to join, and we can leave when we want to leave, and ones that help us, and clearly groups help us pursue whatever it is our goal is ultimately. So in the pursuit of happiness, there are lots of groups that one wants to form, whether it's marriage, whether it's businesses, whether it's sports teams, whether it's there are lots of different groups one wants to form. But the question is, what is the standard of well-being? Is it the standard of well-being some algorithm that maximizes the well-being of a group, some utilitarian function? Is it something that's inherent in the group that we can measure as goodness and to hell with individuals within, as long as we can get that the group to function well. We don't really care about where the individuals are. So to me, the goal of creating groups is the well-being of the individual, and that's why it needs to be voluntary, and that's why there has to be a way out of those. Sometimes it's costly. It's not a cheap out. That's why you should really think about what groups you and this, on an issue that's very controversial, maybe we can discuss, maybe not. This is why, to me, immigration is so important, right? Open immigration, free immigration, is because that's another group that I would like people to be able to voluntarily choose, both in and out. And I'd like to see people be able to go and join that group that, that they believe will allow for the pursuit of happiness. But let me say that, that's a description of an ideal, what I'm just saying. I recognize that that's not the reality of this world. I recognize that that's not the reality in which history, recognizing that that the individual exists in a sense philosophically is a massive achievement, right? Human beings, however they evolved, clearly we started out in a tribal context in which the individual didn't matter. We followed the leader. The competition was for power over the group, and dictates how the group should work. The history of human beings is a history of gaining knowledge, and part of the knowledge is the value of an individual. And you can see that in religion, you can see that in philosophy, you can see that through the evolution. And then, we evolved from tribes into nations, and then empires, and conflict between nations and conflict between empires. And we tried a lot of different things, if you will. I think we always did it on purpose, but we kind of did different philosophies, different sets of ideas drove us towards different collectives, different groupings, and different ways in which to structure. And after, 3,000 years of kind of known history, there's history before that, but we don't know much about it. 3,000 years of known history. You can sit back and evaluate. And I think that's what is done in the Enlightenment. And you sit back, and certainly we can do it today. We can sit back and evaluate what promotes human flourishing and what doesn't. And what do we mean by human flourishing? Who's flourishing? Well, individual human being. Now, since I don't believe in a zero-sum world, and the world is not zero-sum, we can see that. It's empirically possible to show that the world is not a zero-sum. My human flourishing doesn't come at your expense. So I could show that a system that promotes my flourishing will probably promote your flourishing as well, and promotes the general welfare in that sense, because it promotes individuals' flourishing. And we can look at all these examples of how we evolved and what leads to bloodshed and what doesn't, and what promotes this ability to flourish as an individual. Again, an achievement, the idea of individual flourishing. And then we can think about how to create a political system around that, a political system that recognizes and allows for the formation of groups, but just under the principle of voluntary. You can't be forced to join a group. You can't be coerced into forming a group. Other than the fact that you're born in a particular place, in a particular, that in a sense. But that's not force. There's a difference between metaphysics and between choices.
So this is something that came up in the debate, that Yoram said that not all human relations are voluntary, and you kind of emphasized that a lot of where we are is not voluntary. We're grounded. We're connected in so much. So how can a human be free in the way you're describing? Individual be free if some part of who we are is not voluntary. Some part of who we are is other people.
Well, because what do we mean by freedom? Freedom doesn't mean the negation of the laws of physics, right? Freedom doesn't mean ignoring. Freedom means the ability within the scope of what's available for you to choose, being able to choose those things. So, in a political context, freedom means the absence of coercion. So once you're an adult, Yoram says you're born with into a particular religious context. Absolutely, but once you're an adult, I think it's incumbent on you to evaluate that religious context and look at different religions or non-religion or whatever, and choose your philosophy of life, choose your values, choose how you want to live your life. That's the freedom. The freedom is one system says, you're either coerced by the state or coerced by the group or coerced by society around you to follow a particular path, or the expectation is, the demand is, the pressure is to conform to a particular path. And my view is, no, you should be in a position to be able to choose your path. And that choice means you look around, you evaluate based on history, based on knowledge, based on all of these things. And you choose what that path will be. That's fundamentally what freedom means. Yes, you cannot choose your parents, but of course not. Nobody would claim that that's within the scope of what is possible.
I think the coercion freedom dichotomy, these are too few concepts. Coercion and freedom. It's too simplistic to be able to describe what we're actually dealing with. The traditional Anglo-conservative view is that society has to be ordered, it has to be disciplined. And there are two choices for how it can be ordered. One is that a people is, by its own traditions, you would say voluntarily, these are mostly inherited traditions, by its own traditions, it is ordered. For example, people just in general will not go into somebody else's yard because that's the custom here is we don't go into somebody else's yard without their permission. And so Fortescue, we're talking about 500 years ago already. So Fortescue says that the genius of the English people is that our government should be mild and apply very little coercion because the people are so disciplined. And when he says the people are so disciplined, what he's saying is that our nation, our tribes, we have strong traditions which channel people, but through the tools of being honored and dishonored. Now, that's a reality that exists in every society, and it's not captured by your distinction between coercion and lack of coercion. When I'm going to be dishonored if I don't care for my aging mother, I'm not being coerced like the state comes and puts a gun to my head, but I am being pressured. I'm being given guidelines.
But I'm saying that's wrong, and I'm saying that it's dangerous because that can easily be used for bad tradition. But what's the standard by which we evaluate what a good tradition is a bad tradition? It's the English.
You're getting to the standard too fast. Wait. You're getting to the standard too fast. First, I want to know factually, is it true that all societies work like this? Because if it's true that all societies work like this, then saying we should be free from it is just a fantasy.
No, I don't think all societies work like this. I think much of what happened in America post-founding in the 1960s didn't look like that. I think that's the genius of America. And I think what happened during the 19th century in the Industrial Revolution, what happened in the 19th century, to some extent globally, but certainly in the United States, didn't work that way. It broke tradition. I think all innovation breaks tradition. And I think that's what the genius of this country is and the post-Enlightenment world is. I think pre that tradition, they work that way. And then the question is, do people understand why they do what they do? That is, I don't want people doing what I think is right just because I think it's right, and I've created a society in which, okay, somebody founded this country in a particular way, so we're just going to follow. I want people to understand what they're doing. So I want people to have a respect for property, not because it's a tradition, because they understand the value of a respect for property. I want people not to murder one another, not because it's a commandment, thou shalt not murder, but because they have an understanding of why murdering is bad and wrong and what's bad for them and bad for the kind of world that they want to live in. And I think that's what we achieve through enlightenment, through education, through where we don't treat people just as a blob, tribe that just follows orders. But we now treat individuals as capable of thinking for themselves, capable of discovering truth, capable of figuring out their own values. And that's the big break between, and this is why, this is the break I think that the Declaration represents. The break between society that is based on tradition, following commandments, following rules, because they are the rules, because they are the commandments, and a society where individuals understand those rules, yes, it's now become a tradition, let's say, to respect the individual right, to respect property rights. But they're not following it because it's a tradition. They're following it because they understand what it is about it that makes it good. So that's the world I think that we were on the process of evolving towards. And that is what got destroyed in the 20th century and is certainly disappeared today. And I think that's a great tragedy, is that we're evolving to a place where people understood the values that represent. And of course, the danger with tradition is, I mean, we'll agree, right? It's okay to kill the Jew, right? Or it's okay to steal people's property if they're of a certain color, or it's okay to enslave. Those are all traditions. And yet, once you stop and say, but what are they based on? Is this right? Is this just based on some moral law? No, it's not. There's something wrong here. We can't achieve happiness and success if we follow these.
You're talking about reason and tradition, but I think I would love to sort of linger on the stickiness of humans that you described. So you kind of said that it's primary, the individual is primary, and that was a great invention. But to me, it's not at all obvious that somehow that's the invention that humans have been practicing for a very long time, of the stickiness of community, of family, of love. That's not obvious to me. That's not also fundamental to human flourishing. It should be celebrated and protected. Now, I suppose the argument you're making is when you start to let the state define what the stickiness, how the stickiness looks between humans, so you're really like the voluntary aspect. But I just want to sort of the observation is humans seem to be pretty happy when they form communities, however you define that. So romantic partnership, family.
Some communities, people are miserable in other communities. So the nature of the community matters, right? We know this. We know that some bondings are not healthy and not good for the individuals involved, and they don't thrive. So I absolutely. I mean, I'm a lover, not a fighter, right? So I'm a huge believer in love. The whole philosophy, I think, is a love-based philosophy. I fight in order to love, right? So it's love is at the core of all of this. It's a love of life. It's a love of the world out there, and it's a love of other people because they represent a value to you. So the stickiness is there. It's my point is, it should be chosen. It should be consciously chosen. And this is, I'm put aside the state. Forget the state for a minute. Forget coercion. Forget all that. What I would encourage individuals to do, and this is where, I'm not primarily a political, interested in politics at all. I tend to talk most about that. I'm primarily interested in human beings and how they live, in a sense, in morality. And what I would urge individuals to do is to think about their relationship, to choose the best relationships possible, but to seek out great relationships, because other human beings are an immense value to us. And when I write, maybe you quoted this or not, but I write that about the trader principle and trading. It's easy and obvious to think of it as a materialistic kind of thing. I get, I do the chores this day, and my wife does the chores the other day. We're trading, but trading is much more subtle than that, and can be much more spiritual than that. It's about the trading in emotions. It's about the way one sees each other. It's what one gets from one another. I think friendship is a form of trade. Now I know that seems to make it material, but I don't think it's a trade as a material thing. But friendship is incredibly important in life. Love is incredibly important in life. Having a group of friends is incredibly important. Well, all of these are sticky and important.
Okay, how can I try to be eloquent on this? So, if you give people freedom, if you give people, well, not politics, relationships. So this is interesting because we have an interesting dynamic going on here in terms of beliefs. They're differing, and so there's interesting overlaps. But there is a worry. If you look at human history and you study the lessons of history, and you look at modern society, if you give people freedom in terms of stickiness and human relations and so on, if you not give people freedom, emphasize freedom as the highest ideal, you start getting more tender online dating. The stickiness dissolves, just like in chemistry. You start to have a gas versus a liquid, right? That's the warrior. So you have to study what actually happens. If you emphasize that the stickiness, the bonds of humans is holding you back, the exercise of voluntary choice is the highest ideal. The danger of that is for that to be implemented or interpreted in certain kinds of ways by us flawed humans that are not. I mean, you could say we're perfectly reasonable and rational. We could think through all of our decisions, but really, I mean, especially when you're young, you get horny, you make decisions that are suboptimal, perhaps. So the point is, you have to look at reality of when you emphasize different things. So when you talk about this, the ideal life, the ideal relation, that's also like, what do you emphasize? I think you both agree on what's important, that continue to be important, that freedom is important, but what do you emphasize? And you're really emphasizing the individual, and you're emphasizing you're on more of the community, of the family, of the stickiness of the nation.
Well, I don't want to deny the place of the individual. I think that there really is a very great change in civilization when the books of Moses announced that the individual is created in the image of God. That's a step that, as far as we know, without precedent. And to a very large degree, one of the kind of things on is that Yaron and I really do agree on all sorts of things. I think in part because we're both Jewish, and
You did just say Yaron is basically Moses.
no, I said he was channeling Moses, but that's still in my book. You know that's still
Pretty
pretty.
impressive.
No, that's a compliment.
That's pretty. That, for me, that's a compliment.
And we'll talk about this a little bit just for the listener, just so they know Yaron, amongst many things, we'll talk about the virtue of nationalism, but you're also a religious scholar of sorts, or at least leverage the Bible for not much, but some of the wisdom in your life.
Look, the way that Yaron looks at enlightenment, or maybe at Ayn Rand, that's the way that I see the Hebrew scripture and the tradition that comes from it. It has the same kind of place in my life, and I don't know how much we want to explore it, but I think that that the agreement that we do have about the positive value of the creative individual, the positive value of the individual's desire to improve the world, and in my book that means including his or her desire to improve his family, his tribe, his congregation, his nation. But it still comes from this kind of, what Yaron calls selfishness, right? The desire to make things better for yourself. In Hebrew Bible and in Judaism, that just is a positive thing. Of course, it can be taken too far, but it just is positive, and it doesn't carry these kinds of, you should turn the other cheek, you should give away your cloak, you should love your enemy. These kinds of Christian tropes do not exist in Judaism, and so it just. I like listening to Yaron's. I do feel like he goes too far on various things, but I also hear underneath it. I can sort of hear the Jewish current and the resistance to things that about Christianity that Jews often find.
Can I ask you a question there? Can you make an argument for turn the other cheek?
No.
I tend to, I guess you would equate that with altruism. I tend to,
It's unjust.
okay.
Don't
So
give yourself your concern. It's a lack of love, lack of self-respect.
well, let me push back on that because I like turn the other cheek, especially on Twitter. So
I like block the offender on Twitter.
no, what? So Twitter aside is more like you're investing in the long-term version of yourself versus the short-term. So that's the way I think about it. It's like the energy you put out into the world. The turn the other cheek philosophy allows you to walk through the fire gracefully. In some sense. I mean, perhaps you would reframe that as not a, then that's not being altruistic or whatever. But there is something pragmatic about that kind of approach to life.
Disciplining yourself so that you become a better version of yourself. I mean, I not only do we agree, but I think every religious and philosophical tradition probably has a version of that. Even Kant, who we join together and find it to be terrible. Even Kant makes that distinction between the short-term interest and the long-term interest. So I think that's universal. I don't know of anybody who's really disagreeing about that. The thing that we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, before we got onto this tangent, is the relationship between the individual who is in the image of God and is of value as an individual. Nevertheless, there's this question about what is good for that person, and also what makes him happy. I'm not sure that those are exactly the same things, but they're both certainly relevant and important. And I feel like, I think we're beginning to uncover this empirical disagreement about what it is that's good for the individual and what it is that makes them happy. And I'll go back to something I raised I raised in the debate, which is this theory of Durkheim that now has been popularized by Jordan Peterson. But Durkheim argues that he's writing a book on suicide. He's trying to understand what brings individuals to suicide. And he coins this term, anomie, lack of law. And the argument is that individuals basically are healthy and happy when they find their place in a hierarchy. Within a loyalty group, in a certain place in a hierarchy, they compete and struggle in order to rise in the hierarchy, but they know where they are. They know who they are. The kids today like to say they know what their identity is because they associate themselves. Their self expands to take on, the leadership, the different layers, the past and the future of this particular hierarchy. And I completely agree with Yaron that some of these hierarchies are pernicious and oppressive and terrible, and some of them are better. What we might disagree about is that you can find human beings who are capable of becoming healthy and happy off by themselves without participating in this kind of structure. The minute that you accept, if you accept, that this is empirical reality about human beings, it's an iron law. You can't do anything. You can tell human beings that they can be free of all constraints all you want, and you can get them to do things that as you say, dissolve their. They can have contempt for hierarchies. They can say, I'm not going to serve the man. I'm going to, I'm just going to burn them all down. You get them to say get kids to say all of these things. You can get them to be Marxists or actively trying to overthrow and destroy the existing hierarchy. Or you can get them some kind of liberal where they basically pretend the hierarchy is going to exist. They just act like they're not there. In both cases, it's not coincidence that that's what universities do. Even Marxist revolution or liberal ignoring of the hierarchy. In both cases, what you've done is you've eliminated the possibility that the young person will be able to find his or her place in a way that allows them to grow and exercise their love, their drive, their creativity in order to advance something constructive. You've eliminated it. Put the burden on them, kind of an insane person, to just be the fountain of all values yourself. Which, maybe some people can do it, but almost no one can do it. I think they can do it. And so I think by telling them about their freedom, rather than telling them about the need to join into some traditional hierarchy that can be good and healthy for them, I think we're destroying them. I think we're destroying this generation and the last one and the next.
Yaron is the burden of freedom. destroying mankind.
What freedom? I mean, how many people are indeed free? Look, the problem is that we're caught up on political concepts, and we're moving into ethical issues. And I don't think it's right to tell people you're free, go do whatever the hell you want. Just use your emotions. Just go where you want to go. In the spur of the moment. Think short term, don't think long term, but don't think. Right thing. One has to provide moral guidance, and morality here is crucially important. And part of the responsibility for your own life is establishing a moral framework for your life, and what does it mean to live a good life? And that's much more important of a question than it is my belief that people can do that. They can find or choose the values which they keep a good life, but they need guidance. They need guidance. This is why religion evolved, because people need guidance. I call religion a primitive moral philosophy. It was the original philosophy that provided people with some guidance about what to do and what not to do. And secular philosophy is supposed to be the same. And the problem is that I think religion and 99% of secular philosophy give people bad advice about what to do, and therefore they do bad stuff. And some of that sometimes, because when they do good stuff, it gets reinforced to be survived in spite of that. Ideas like Kant and Hegel and Marx and stuff give young people thoughtful advice about how to live and what to do. And so really bad stuff happens. The world in which we live today, we believe there's a lot of pathology to it, there's a lot of bad stuff going on. In my view, it's going wrong. In my view, a product of a set of ideas. On the one hand, I think Christian ideas, on the other hand, I think secular philosophical ideas that have driven this country and the world more truthfully in a really bad direction. And this is why I do what I do, because I think at the core of it, the only way to change it is not to impose a new set of ideas from the top, because I worry about who's going to be in a position. Plus, I don't believe you can force people to do it. It's to challenge the ideas. It's to question the ideas. It's to present an alternative view of morality, an alternative set of moral principles, ultimately an alternative view of political principles. But it has to start with morality. If you don't, and my morality is centered on the individual, what the individual can do with his life in order to attain a good life. I believe that leads to happiness, but the good life, that's why it's good, right? The goal is survival and thriving and flourishing and happiness ultimately. But politics is a servant of that, and it's not an end in itself. So the real issue, you asked before, what is the value of relationship? There's enormous value in relationship because we get values from other people. We don't produce all our values. We don't produce all our spiritual values. And we don't produce all our material values. Other people on a massive benefit to us because they produce values we can't. There's a massive division of labor in terms of values, not just in economics, but also in philosophy and elsewhere. It's why we have teachers. It's why we have moral teachers. Moral teachers are important to help guide us towards a good life. Not all of us are philosophers. But what I do demand is the role of individuals. This is where I put a burden on people, right? Understand what's right? Don't embrace a moral teaching because it was tradition. Don't embrace a moral teaching because your parents embraced it. Don't embrace a moral teaching just because your teachers are teaching it. Challenge it. Think about it. Embrace it because you embrace it. You might be wrong. You might embrace the wrong one, but take moral responsibility. Take responsibility over your life by evaluating, testing, challenging what you have received and choosing what you're going to pursue. And I acknowledge empirically that most people don't do that. And this is why intellectual leadership is so important. This is why you want to get people. You want the voices in a culture to be good voices, so that those people who don't think for themselves will end up being followers, but they end up being followers of something good versus followers of something bad. But for the thinkers in the world out there, who I think are the people who count, the people who shape society.
No, shape society.
Wait a minute, that counts in a sense that you can dismiss the lives of others, because obviously I'm anti-coercion and
They
anti-violence.
sound like Plato.
But yes, I don't want to sound like Plato, but in a sense that they're the ones who end up shaping the world. They're the ones who end up shaping how the world is. I want those people to make choices about their values and not to just accept them based on tradition or based on commandment or based on where they happen to grow up. And in that sense, again, I do, and this is an interesting point where we disagree, but I'm not exactly sure what your position is. I do believe in universal values. That is, there are things that are good, and there are things that are evil, and I think we agree on that. And there are systems. We agree that communism and fascism are evil. Well, I think we should be able to agree that some political systems are good. Yeah. And maybe there's this middle ground where we both think that they're not particularly bad, but not particularly good, and you all might think they're better than I think they are. But if we can agree on this is good and this is evil, right? Then the systems that tend towards the good are good, and the systems that tend towards the evil are evil. And but that's universal, right? I look at places like South Korea, Japan, Asia, cultures that are very, very different in many respects of the West. And yet when they adopt certain Western ideas, right, about freedom, about liberty, about individualism. I mean, the Japanese Constitution, because MacArthur forced it in there, has the pursuit of happiness in the Constitution, not because they chose it, because they put it in there. But they, to some extent, adopted that, and they have successful places today. Those societies in Asia that didn't adopt these values are not successful societies today.
Japan has a birth rate of, what is it, 1.1, 1.2 children per woman. I mean, look, there are some things, there's some places where you give people freedom. This is also biblical, right? The idea that everyone did what's right in his own eyes. Okay, right? This is a refrain in the book of Judges. And the Bible is not an anti-freedom book. There's many. No, we're not. Fine.
We'll get there.
Okay.
He's gonna guide.
Okay. Look, just as an asterisk, I'm not asking you because the Bible is such a great authoritarian book. It's not that at all. In my view, if you want to know where this what you call the sanctity of property, where does the sanctity of property comes from? It comes from the Ten Commandments. It comes from Moses saying, I haven't taken anything from anyone. It comes from Samuel saying, I haven't taken anything from anyone. It's the condemnation of Chav, the unjust kings who steal the property of their subjects. So I'm not. So I'm property and freedom. I think there's great basis for it in the Bible. But right now, I'm focusing on this other question, which is, what happens when everyone does what's right in his own eyes? That's the book of Judges, and that's this civil war, moral corruption, theft, idolatry, murder, rape. I mean, that's what happens when everyone does whatever's right in his own eyes. But well, no, that's what it says in the text. I'm not okay. So when I look at, you're right. There are things that I think are objectively true. I think it's really hard to get people to agree to them. Almost impossible. But when I look at a country which is approaching one birth per woman, in other words, half of the minimum necessary for replacement. You can say whatever you want about immigration. You can have that discussion, but the point is that when your values are such that you're not even capable of doing the most basic techniques that human beings need in order to be able to propagate themselves and their values and the way they see things, then I look, you're finished. You can't say that.
So if I implied that Japan is an ideal society, I take that back. But
I just
think about Japan for a minute.
I just think we're in trouble, and we're in trouble.
Yeah. Give me a second. Hold you that.
Tutorial.
No, I'm sorry.
It's his show, man. We enter into his hierarchy. That's it.
We should talk about hierarchy.
Just to clarify, how do you explain the situation in Japan? Is it the decrease in value in family, like some of the just to expand on that, like how do you explain that situation? You're saying that society is in trouble in a certain way. You kind of describe the nature of that.
I'm saying that when the individual is part of social group, this can be a family, a congregation, community, a tribe, a nation. When the individual feels that the things that are happening to the society are things that are happening to him or to her. And I want to emphasize, this is not the standard view of collectivism that, Mussolini will say, the glory of the individual is in totally immersing himself in the organic whole. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that human beings have and are both. They enter into a society to which they are loyal, and they compete with one another with, in the terms of that society like competition, but also sometimes by bending the rules and by shaping them and by changing them. What you see in many societies, certainly throughout the liberal West, but also in countries that have been affected by the liberal West, by industrialization and ideas of individualism, what you see is a collapse of a willingness of the individual to look at what is needed by the whole, and to make choices that are as Jorn would call them selfish, because the purpose of them is self-expression, competition, self-assertion, moving up in the hierarchy, achieving honor or wealth in order to do those things. But when you stop being able to look at the framework of a particular society and identify with it, you lose you cease to understand what it is that you need to do. Not every single person, but I'm talking about society-wide. So there are few individuals who are just going to have a fantastic time and live the kind of life that Yaron is describing, and the great majority, they stop being willing to take risks. They stop being willing to get married. They stop being willing to have children. They stop being willing to start companies. They stop being willing to put themselves out to do great things, because the guide rails that told them what kinds of things, and the social feedback that honored them when they did things like getting married and having children, they've been crushed. And what have they been crushed by? They've been crushed by the false view that if you tell the individual, be free, make all your own decisions, that they will then be free and make all their own decisions. They don't. They just stop. They stop being human.
That's powerful. So, do you want to respond to that?
Yes. So I don't think anybody should have children. If the goal, there's a good tweet clip that you can make. I don't think anybody should have children for the goal of perpetuating the nation or expanding the society, or for some people, I think they'd make horrible parents if that was the goal, the purpose of doing it. I think people should have children because they want to embrace that challenge, that beauty, that experience, that amazing, very, very hard, very, very difficult experience in life. It's about being able to project the long term, but also being able to enjoy and love the creation of another human being. That process of creation. It is a beautiful, self-interested thing. And by the way, not everybody should have children. I think way too many people have children. There's some awful parents out there that I wish would stop. I mean, there are. Life is precious, and life of suffering is sad. It's sad to see people suffer, and a lot of people are born into situations and are born into parents that destroy their capacity to ever live a good life, and that's a tragic and sad thing. And so I don't measure the health of a society in how many children they're having, or health of a couple, whether they have children or not. Those are individual choices. Some people make a choice not to have children, which is completely rational and consistent with their values. Now, when you look at a society overall, I do think having children or not having children is a reflection of something. I think it's a reflection of a certain optimism about the future. I think it's a reflection of thinking long-term versus short-term. I think a short-term society doesn't have children. People don't have children there because children are long-term investment. They require real planning and real effort and real thinking about the long-term. But those are moral issues. And again, we're confusing or mixing. When I say Japan, look how well Japan has done. I don't mean the specific Japanese people and how many kids they're having and what kind of life they're having. in terms of these kind of particulars. But think about the alternatives Japan faces. If you look around, the options, right, that they face. They tried empires. They tried nationalistic empires. Didn't turn out too well for them or anybody who they interacted with. They could have become North Korea. We know how that too. We know what that is. They could have been Cambodia. If we were being Cambodia and seen the kind of poverty. And yes, maybe Cambodians have lots of children. But God, I'd rather be in Japan any day than have children in the kind of poverty and horrific circumstances they have. But in the context of the available regimes that were possible post-World War II for the Japanese to embrace, they embraced one that generally led to prosperity, to freedom, to individuals pursuing values. Not perfectly, because they didn't implement the philosophical foundation, the moral foundation that I would like to have. They're still being impacted by Kantian, Hegelian, whatever philosophy that's out there in the West that's destroying the better parts. So you give people freedom. Now, what do they do with it? And if they have a bad philosophy, they're going to do bad things with that freedom, right? You tell people to do whatever they choose to do, but if they have bad ideas, they will choose to do bad things. So it is true that the primacy of morality and the primacy of philosophy has to be recognized. It's not the primacy of politics. And indeed, you don't get free societies unless you have some elements of decent philosophy. But you can get free societies with a rotten philosophy, but they don't stay free for very long.
I don't understand, how can it be a decent philosophy if it doesn't care about prosperity? If it does, if you're willing to say, I'm offering guidance. I think you should live as a trader. All relationships should be voluntary. Those are interesting things. But the moment that it comes to posterity, to the future, to there being a future, let's say that there were a society that was the way, in general, according to your view, let's say there was such a society. How can you not care whether that society is capable of passing it on to the next generation or not?
But the way to pass it on to the next generation is through ideas and not through having children. Having children is an individual choice that some people are going to make and some people are not. But they're fundamental that preserves the good life.
What does that even mean?
There's a sense to it.
If every generation from now on, your society that was good at a certain point has half as many people in it, it's going to very quickly. It's just going to be overrun. Overrun by whom? What do you mean overrun by whom? Are we just totally ahistorical? If you're the Spartans and you have all of these, like warrior values, but you stop having children, you get overrun, you get defeated.
Well, in the case of Sparta, it's a good thing, not a bad thing. But I get
That's
it.
my point. You have to have the ability to have enough children to create enough wealth and enough power, enough strength.
Who makes these kind of conclusions and decisions about how many? You make it as an individual. If you decide that
we're not talking about we're talking about what kind of intellectual, cultural, religious inheritance you give your children.
Yes,
right?
And those are the ideas that I give my children. And those ideas are going to perpetuate because they're good ideas. If they're bad ideas,
they're not going to perpetuate. They can be. They can't be good ideas if they don't produce future generations. What are you talking about?
Why would they not produce future generations?
I mean, as I look at every liberal society on earth, but is in democratic collapse.
There's not a single liberal society on earth today that I'm willing to defend.
But
because they're not living by
so
they did not accept my idea. So they have a semblance. I have a semblance of a political system that is a little bit like what I would like. Far from what I would ideal. But they certainly don't have a moral foundation. I believe that people who have the right moral foundation, most of them, not all of them, but most of them will have children. Most of them will continue into the future. Most of them will fight for a future. But not because they care what happens in 200 years, but because they care about their lifetime. And part of having fun and enjoying one's lifetime is having kids, is projecting into the future.
Are you really going to tell me that people have children because it's fun? They're fun when they're 4 years old. They're not fun when they're 15. No,
when they're 15.
They're just not fun. Look, you don't do
I'm learning so much today.
You don't do this for fun. Marriage also you don't do for fun. There are times that are fun and there are times that are not fun.
Fun is not exactly the right word, but you certainly do it for happiness. You do it for fulfillment. You do it as a challenge. You do it for making your life better, for making your life interesting, for making your life challenging, for embracing. You know, part of it is fun, part of it is hard work, but you do it because it makes your life a better life.
It's very interesting. So empirically speaking, if you dissolve the cultural backbone where everybody comes up, like background, the moral ideas that everybody is raised with, if you dissolve that, if you truly emphasize the individual, I think Yoram is saying it's going to naturally lead to the dissolution of marriage and all these concepts. So you're not, so like everything, well, basically saying you're not going to choose some of these things. You're going to more and more choose the short-term optimization versus the long-term optimization beyond your own life or posterity. So
I don't think about posterity. I don't know what posterity means, right? I can project into my children's life. Maybe when I have grandchildren, the grandchildren's life, but it ends there. I can't project 300 years in the future. It's ridiculous to try to think about 300 years into the future. Things change so much. And
that's the founding fathers. That's the conservative founding fathers.
Well, no, I don't think. I think they set up a system. I think the whole idea was to set up a system that was self-perpetuating, that would if people lived up to it, right? Would perpetuate the self.
No systems are self-perpetuating. Things rise and fall, and
they don't necessarily rise and fall. I don't believe in that.
Let me speak to your heart for a second. The great individuals in societies are the people who have seen the decline, understood it, and provided resources in order to redirect and bring it back up. You can't agree to that?
I don't see it that way at all. Yes, I want people out there to rebel against conventional morality. I think conventional morality is destructive to their own lives and broadly to posterity, because I think it's unsustainable, it's not good, and it goes to, I think conventional morality is Christian morality. It's a morality that's been secularized through Christian lens, and I think it's destructive. But I don't want them to dump that and not replace it with something. I want, and I think it's necessary and essential for people to have a moral code. And to have a moral code. Morality is a set of guidelines to live your life. It is a set of values to guide you, to help you identify what is good for you and what is bad for you.
Here's the thing. Let me hold on a second. You're saying central to this morality that people should have is reason.
Yes.
Okay. You're not saying other things. You're basically saying reason will arrive at a lot of things. Why are you so sure that reason is so important?
There's nothing else.
No, hold on a second. But like, it seems like obvious to you. So first of all, humans have limited cognitive capacity. So even to assume the reason could actually function that well from an artificial intelligence researcher perspective, it seems
the whole discussion about whether there is such a thing as artificial intelligence, whether that is what it is.
But see, here's the thing. I mean, you're very confident about this particular thing, but not about other aspects of human nature that seems to be obviously present. So yes, almost human relations, love, connection between us. So it's very possible to argue that all of the accomplishments of reason would not exist without the connection of other humans.
Of course, that's true.
It's not obvious, though. It's possible that reason is a property of the collective, of multiple people interacting with each other. When you look at the greatest inventions of human history, some people tell that story by individual inventors. You could argue that's true. Some people say that it's a bunch of people in the room together. The idea is bubbling. And if you're saying individual is primary and they have the full power and the capacity to make choices, I don't know if that's necessarily obvious.
So there's a straw manning going on here.
Yeah.
Of my position, right?
Yep.
Of course.
My favorite thing to do.
You don't do it, and you do it more politely than anybody else I know when you do it. Of course, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Of course, invention and science is collaborative. Not always, not 100%. Newton stood on the shoulders of giants. I don't know how collaborative he was. He wasn't exactly known as a bubbling up and testing ideas out with other people. But this is a metaphysical fact. You can't eat for me. There's no collective stomach. You can't eat for me. You know, you can provide me with food, but I need to do the eating. You can't think for me. You can help stimulate my thought. You can challenge my thinking. You can add to it. But in the end of the day, only I can either do my thinking or not do my thinking. But I need to think.
But you can think all by yourself alone.
What does that mean, all by yourself, right? Can I think on a desert island? Yes, I can think on a desert island. Can I think as big and as broad and as deep as I can in Aristotle's Lyceum? Of course not. I'm a much better thinker in Aristotle's Lyceum, or in any kind of situation like this where you're going to challenge me and I have to come back and I have to think deeply about what it is you said and why I'm not communicating very effectively and why you're not understanding me. Of course, now you're causing me to think much more deeply and to challenge me. But it's still true that I have to think. And if I don't think for myself, who's going to think for me, right? So this is why I'm not a philosopher. I'm certainly not an original thinker in that sense. I recognize the fact that there are geniuses that are much smarter than me, whether it's Aristotle, Ayn Rand, or people that inspire me. I study their work. I try to understand it to the best of my ability, but I don't take it as gospel. I take it as, this is something I need to figure out. I need to learn it. I need to understand it because it's good for my life. It's important to me. But I have to do the thinking. It won't be mine. It'll be Ayn Rand, but it won't be mine unless I've done the thinking to integrate it into my soul, into my consciousness, into my mind. But it's still true that I have to think for myself. Not on a desert island. I now regret ever using a desert island in the book as an example because
We've achieved something.
Because clearly it was misunderstood. I didn't make myself clear enough in the book in terms of what I meant. But I do not advocate for thinking alone in a dark room, not engaging with reality, not studying history, not knowing about the world, or on a desert island, not interacting with your collective. No, I'm a trader. So I enjoy what we're doing right now because you're challenging me. You make me a better thinker. It's interesting, the fact that a lot of people are going to watch this plays into it as well. But I would probably enjoy engaging with you in conversation.
Not even recording, so
yeah, there you go. I would enjoy engaging with you in conversation, even if it wasn't being recorded, and even if it was because, that kind of conversation makes me better. There's some people who wouldn't. There's some people who make it worse, right? That you walk away from the conversation because they're harmful to you. And this is where choice comes in. I want to be able to choose who I engage with. I don't always have that choice because there's a public intellectual, you go in front of audiences, you don't always choose who it is, but you want to choose who you engage with and who you don't. You want to choose the forum in which you engage and how you engage. And the standard for me is reason. There is no other standard. So you asked a few questions to start off. Why reason? Because that's where the values come from. That's the only tool we have to discover truth. Yes, reason is something that it doesn't guarantee truth. It doesn't guarantee we're always right. It's fallible. But it's all we have. It's the tool in which we evaluate the world around us and we come to conclusions about it. There just isn't other tool. Emotions are not tools of cognition.
Consciousness is a tool, emotion, like love, all of these things are ways to experience the world. To say that reason is the best tool.
But there's a difference between experiencing the world and evaluating the world in terms of what is truth or what is not.
As a scientist, I appreciate the value of reason.
And emotions and love are consequences. They're not primary. Emotions are consequences of conclusions you've come to. Your emotions will change very quickly, relatively speaking, when your evaluations of a situation will change. Different people can see exactly the same scene and have completely different emotions because they're bringing different value systems and they're bringing different thoughts to the process.
Maybe love is primary, but let me ask.
Love is the same thing. You just fall out of love with somebody. Why? Because you learned something new, because you've discovered something new about the person. Now you don't love them.
The wrong podcast to bring up love. We'll talk forever about it. So, you wrote the book, The Virtue of Nationalism, contrasting nation states with empires and global governance like the United Nations and so on. So, you argue that nationalism uniquely provides the collective right of the free people to rule themselves. So continuing our conversation, why is this particular collection of humans we call a nation a uniquely powerful way to preserve the freedom of people to have people themselves.
Before I say anything on the subject, I should emphasize that I'm not a rationalist. I'm an empiricist. I'm offering uh, what I think is a valid observation of human history. I don't have some kind of deductive framework for proving that that the nation is the best. And empirically, we know something about the way systems of national states work, and about the way empires work, and the way tribal societies work. What we don't know is, is it possible to invent something else? Or, I mean, there's a lot of things we don't know here. So, with the caveat that I'm making an empirical observation, the basic argument is human beings form collectives naturally, loyalty groups, and for most of human history and prehistory, as far as we know, human beings lived in tribal societies. Tribal societies are societies in which there's um, constant friction and constant warfare among very small groups, among families and clans. And we reach a turning point in human history with the invention of large-scale agriculture, which allows the creation of vast wealth. It allows the establishment of standing armies instead of militias. Sargon of Akkad says, I can pay 5,000 men to do nothing other than to drill in the arts of war, and then I'm going to send them out to conquer the neighboring city-states, and there you have empire. The Bible, which is the source of our image, our conception of a world of independent nations that are not constantly trying to conquer one another. The source of that is the Bible, and the biblical world is one in which Israel and various other small nations are trying to fight for their independence against world empires, against empires Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Egyptian, which aspire to rule the world. My claim is fundamentally twofold. It's moral, that whenever you conquer a foreign nation, you're murdering and you're stealing, you're destroying. As your own would say, you're using force to cause people to submit. So there is something in the prophets that rebels against this ongoing atrocity and carnage of trying to take over the whole world. And there's a prudential, practical argument, which is that the world is governed best when there are multiple nations, when they're free to experiment and chart their own courses. That means they have their own route to God, they have their own moralities, they have their own forms of economy and government. And what tends to happen in history is that when something is successful, when something looks like, when people, a different nation looks at it and say, well, those people they're flourishing, they're succeeding, then it's imitated. And, in the way that, the Dutch invented the stock market, and the English said, look, that makes them powerful, so we'll adopt it. So that there's endless examples of that. So that's the argument for it. The argument is since we don't know a priori, deductively, from self-evident principles, what is best. It's best, which people are trying different things.
So, quick question, because the word nationalism sometimes is presented in a negative light in connection to the nationalism of Nazi Germany, for example.
Yeah.
So you're looking empirically at a world of nations that respect each other.
I use the word nationalism the way that I inherited it in my tradition,
Yes,
which is, it's a principled standpoint that says that the world is governed best when many nations are able to be independent and chart their own course. That's nationalism. As far as the Nazis, Hitler's an imperialist. He hated nation states. His whole theory, if you pick up, I don't recommend doing this, but if you do,
I'm actually reading it right now, Mein Kampf.
right, if you do read Mein Kampf, that you'll see that he says explicitly that the goal is for Germany to be the lord of the earth and mistress of the globe, and he detests the idea of the independent nation state because he sees it as weak and effete. He might as well have said it's Jewish.
So let me ask, from the individual perspective, for nationalism, what do you make of the value of the love of country? the reason I connect that, so I personally, what would you say, a patriot? I love the love of country, or I am susceptible, or how, in a Randian way, I enjoy, in a
Love is
self-interest.
good. Love is a good
Yeah.
word.
But, well, I love a lot of things, but I'm saying this particular love is a little bit contentious, which is loving your country. That's an interesting love that some people are a little uncomfortable with. Even when, especially when that love, I grew up in the Soviet Union. To say you just love the country. It represents a certain thing to you. It's not, you don't think like philosophically, like I was marching around with like marks under my arm or something like that. It's just loving community at the level of nation. It's very interesting. I don't know if that's an artifact of the past that we're going to have to strip away. I don't know if I was just raised in that kind of community, but I appreciate that. But I guess the thing I'm torn about is that love of country that I have in my heart, that I now love America and I consider myself an American. That would have easily, if I was born earlier, been used by Stalin, and I would have probably died on the battlefield. I would have probably died if I was in Nazi Germany as a German, and I would probably die as an American. Yes. No, I think about this a lot.
It's interesting to run a radical counterfactual, be sure of the answer. I mean,
I'm not sure, but I think about this a lot because obviously I'm really interested in history, and this is the way I think about most situations is I empathize. I really try to do hard work of placing myself in that moment and thinking through it. I just know myself psychologically and what I'm susceptible to. That's a negative way to phrase it, but what I would love doing. And so I'm just saying, my question is the love of nation a useful or a powerful moral, sort of from a moral philosophy perspective, a good thing?
I think it is a good thing, but before we ask whether it's a good thing, I think it's worth asking whether there's any way to live without it. The idea of national independence, of a world or a continent which politically is governed by multiple independent national states, that is a political theory. Somebody came up with that. In the Bible or elsewhere, someone came up with this idea and sold it, and a lot of people like it. But the nation is not an invention. Every place in human history that we have any record of, there are nations. And so the fact of people creating families creating an alliance of clans creating alliances of tribes creating alliances of and an alliance that becomes the nation. We see that everywhere in human history, everywhere we look. And the love of a group of tribes that have come together in order to fight opponents that are trying to destroy your way of life and steal your land and harm your women and children. The love of the leadership that brings it together. This is a George Washington type figure, or an Alfred the Great type figure, or Saul, the biblical Saul, somebody who has the wisdom, the daring to unite the tribes, overcome their internal mutual hatreds and grievances, and rally them around a set of ideas, a language, a tradition, an identity, as people say today. That love is ineradicable from human beings. Maybe we'll have brave new world people who take drugs in order to get rid of it.
The problem is that could be leveraged by authoritarian leadership.
Yes, but that's true of everything. It's like saying, you can have children and you can teach them to be evil. You can make a lot of money, you can use it for evil. You can have a gun for self-defense, but you can use it for evil. Come on, that's human. That's being human.
But you guys are making love this primary, which I don't think it is. There are lots of people.
Dare you, Your Honor.
I know there are lots of people in the world out there who don't love their nation because their nation is not worth loving. that is love is conditional. It's not unconditional. Love is conditioned on the value that's presented to you. So I lived through this experience in my own life. Right? I grew up in Israel at a time of everything was geared towards patriotism in the state. I would say I was trained to when I saw a grenade jump on it, because that was, every song and every story and everything was about the state is everything and you should sacrifice. And when the flag went up, I got teary-eyed. I mean, I bought into it completely. And at some point, I rejected it. And I changed. And I changed my alliance. And I rejected my love of Israel. It's not that I don't love it anymore. It's certainly not my top love. And I'm certainly not looking for the grenade to jump on, and I'm not volunteering to go fight over there. And I fell in love from a distance with the idea of America. I love the idea of America more than I love America. Right? And I could see myself falling in love, out of love with America, given where it's heading. Right? It's not automatic. It's conditioned on what it is that it represents and what value it represents for me. And I think that's always the case with love. It's not true that children have to love their parents. That's the ideal, and hopefully most children love their parents because their parents. But some children fall out of love with their parents because their parents don't deserve their love. And the same with the other way around. I think parents are capable of not loving their children. So love is a conditional thing. It's not automatic. But let me point out an agreement with. Let me say something of an agreement.
You can bribe me with an agreement. Soft blow, right? Mostly, I like to talk to Yaron about his ideas, and I don't want to talk about Ayn Rand, but I want to say something. Just one thing about Ayn Rand. All my kids read Ayn Rand's books. My father read The Fountainhead. I don't know, we know Ayn Rand, and I'll tell you, it is incredibly difficult reading for me. It's painful. It's painful to read. Why is it painful? Not because I disagree with the view of trading and business and the creativity of it, and Reardon Metal. I mean, that stuff moves me, and I do admire it. But to read, a book that's 1,000 pages long, in which nobody is having children, nobody is having a stable marriage, no one is running an admirable government that's fighting for a just cause anywhere. I feel like it's focusing on one aspect of what it is to be human and to flourish, and that everything else is just erased and thrown out as though it's just not part of reality. And I'm scared of what happens to teenagers who hormonally are, in any case, they're programmed to pull away from their parents and experiment with things. They're biologically programmed to do that. And you give them a book which says, look, you don't have to have a family. You don't have to raise children. You don't have to have a country. You don't have to fight for anything. All you have to do is assert yourself in trade. I think it's destructive because it's not realistic. It's just not real.
But I got none of that from the books were not about a family. You could write a book in Ayn Rand style about where people have a family, but the goal, the purpose, it's a novel. It's a novel which is delimited with a particular story. There's one family in Colt Gulch, and there's a little passage about raising children and the value of that, because it's not core to what she is writing about. But that doesn't exclude it. When I read Atlas Shrugged when I was 16, and I read it over the years several times more. It never occurred to me, Ayn Rand's anti-family, I shouldn't have a family. That thought never came into my mind. I always wanted to have children. I continue to want to have children. I thought of it a little differently. I thought of how I would find a partner a little bit differently. I thought about what I would look for in a partner differently, but not that I wouldn't want to get married.
One question I have is, what effect it has on society, so outside of you? So, for example, you mentioned love should be conditional. I think,
well, it is. Whether you like it or not, it is. You might pretend that it isn't, but it's always conditional.
Well, let me try to say something and see if it makes any sense. So, could there be things that are true, like love is conditional, is always conditional, that if you say it often, it has a negative effect on society? So, for example, I mean, so maybe I'm just a romantic, but good luck saying love is conditional to a romantic partner. I mean, you could, I would argue, en masse, that would deteriorate the quality of relationships. If you remind the partner of that truth that is universal, like you have to I mean, okay, maybe it's just me. I'll just speak to myself. It's like there is a certain romantic notion of unconditional love.
It's part of why you have so many destructive marriages. It's part of
So I
why.
would say that's a problem.
Yes, it's a real problem because yes, there is a. Johan talked about honoring your spouse, and there's a real truth there, and I respect that. Yes, you have to do certain things. Love is not you marry somebody, and there's a real attitude out there in the culture. You marry somebody, okay, now we're just gonna cruise. It's just
Right, Hollywood. That's the Hollywood marriage.
you know, marriage is work. Like all values, it's work. It's something you have to reignite every day. You have to the challenges, the real disagreements, the things you fight about, you disagree about, and there's real. If it's a value, you work it out. You struggle through it. You and sometimes you struggle through it. And you come to a conclusion. Nah, this is not going to work, and you dissolve a marriage. And I'm all for dissolving after really fighting for it, because if it's an important value and if you fell in love with this person for a reason, then that's something worth fighting for. I have a feeling that Hollywood goes the other way, but it's not this cruising along and everything is easy. No human relationship is like that. Not friendship, not love, not raising children, not being a child. They require work, and they require thinking, and they require creating the conditions to thrive, and that's the sense in which it's conditional. You have to look at it, and it's very easy not to do the work, and it's very easy to drift away. And I think most people don't do the work. Most people take it, and generally in life, the only place people seem to work is at work, and then they take the rest of their life as I'm going to cruise. And yet, every aspect of your life, the art you choose, the friends you choose, the lovers you choose, all require real thinking and real work to be successful at them. None of them are just there, because there is no such thing as the intrinsic.
Right, I agree with all of that. I was going to say before that the rabbis have this sort of shocking expression, "Tzal gidul banim," the pain of raising children. And I find when I speak to audiences about relationships, I find that in general, and this is cross-cultural, sort of different countries, different religious backgrounds, that in general, young people do not know that the only way to make a marriage work is through a lot of pain and overcoming. They don't know that raising children involves a great deal of pain. They don't know that caring for and helping your parents approach the end of their lives causes a great deal of pain. And everything is kind of this sketchy, very, very sketchy, glimpsy kind of. And I mentioned Hollywood just because everything is made to look easy, except there's kind of a funny breakdown of something. But then maybe there's a divorce. They shoot one another, so then they should get divorced. But the reality of how hard it is to do, and how heroic it is to do it and then overcome, and then actually in the end achieve something, create something that was really, it's almost not discussed. And so to me, it's just not surprising that if there's no parallel to Iran about the heroic saving of a marriage that was on the rocks, how does it actually happen? So,
So it's a good point you're making, but it's something just came to me that I've never thought of before. So that's always good. This is where conversation is good. Look, take the Talmud and the Bible. I can't remember how many years after the Bible the Talmud is written, how long of a period it's written, how many people participating in writing. Ayn Rand was one individual. She wrote a series of books on philosophy, which I think are true. But there's a beginning. There's a lot of work to do. To apply it. So hopefully there will be one of her students who writes a book on relationships. And there'll be somebody who writes a book on developing political theory in greater detail and develop her ethics. She's got a few writings on ethics, and it's in the novels. But there's a lot of work to be done, fleshing it out. What does it mean? How do you? So to say Ayn Rand didn't do everything is a truism. She didn't do everything. Okay, so what? But she laid this amazing philosophical foundation that allows us to take those principles and to apply them to all these realms of human life. And she does it on a scope that few philosophers in human history have done, because she goes from metaphysics all the way to aesthetics, hitting the key. And she's an original thinker on each one of those things. And she might be right, she might be wrong on certain aspects of it. Always happy to have a debate about where she's wrong or where she's not. But there's a lot of work to be done, right? It's not like, and if there were objectivists out there who present it as, okay, human knowledge is over because Ayn Rand wrote these books, that's absurd, right? There's huge amount of work to be done in applying these particular ideas, just like there was for any philosophy. Take these ideas and now apply them to all these realms in human experience, to flesh it out, and make it. And one of the reasons I don't think objectivism is taken off is because there's all this work still to be done that allows it to be relatable to people in every aspect of it.
Let me ask a hard question here.
Can I say what I agreed with you on, Mark?
Sure. This is good. It's a good transition.
This is the clip. This is the clip.
I agree about nations. So I don't like the term nationalism because I fear of what happens when you put an ism at the end of
any words.
Anything. But the nation is a good thing. And having a diversity of nations, in a sense, good thing. And in this sense, I don't think one can come up. So, look, I said, hold that the ideal nation is a nation that protects individual rights. How do you do that? What are the details? How do we define property rights exactly in the internet world? There's going to be disagreement, rational, reasonable disagreement. They're going to be, in my future, the 300 years from now, when my ideas are won finally, right? There will be multiple nations trying to apply the principle of applying individual rights, and they'll do it differently. One of the benefits of federalism is that while you have a national, there are certain issues that you relegate to states, and they can try different things and learn, because there is a huge value in empirical knowledge. Comes there, you can't just deduce it all and figure it all out. You have to experiment. So I hate the idea of a one world government, because experimentation is gone, and if you make a mistake, everybody suffers. I like the idea, and then I like the idea of people being able to choose where they live. But this notion of experimentation, I think, is crucial. But you need a principle. You need a principle. So I don't like the idea of nations if all the nations are going to be bad, right? If all the nations are going to be horrible, then I don't like it. What I like is a variety of nations all practicing basically good ideas, and then we try to figure out, okay, what works better than other things, and what is sustainable and what is not.
Given how many difficult aspects of history and society we talked about, let me ask a hard question of both of you. Yeah. What gives you hope about the future? So we've been describing the reasons to maybe not have hope. What gives you hope? When you look at the world, what gives you hope that in 200 years, and 300 years, and 500 years, like the founders looked into the future, that human civilization will be all right? And more than that, it will flourish.
Two things for me. One is history. So in the very long run, good ideas win. I think in the very long run, you can go through dark ages, but you come out of the dark ages. The good and the just does win in the end, even if it is bloody and difficult and hard to get there. So while I'm quite pessimistic, unfortunately, about the short run, I'm ultimately optimistic that in the long run, good ideas win and they're justified. And I think the fundamental behind that is, I think is that I'm fundamentally positive about human nature. I think human beings can think. They're capable of reasoning. They're capable of figuring out the truth. They're capable of learning from experience. They don't always do it. It's an achievement to do it, but over time they do. And if you create the right circumstances, they will. And when things get bad enough, they look for a way out. They look at maybe at history, if the history is available to them, maybe at just learning from what's around them to find better ways of doing things, and that reinforces itself. But human beings are an amazing creature, right? We're just amazing in our capacity to be creative, and our capacity to think, and our capacity to love, and our capacity to change our environment to fit our needs and to fit our requirements for survival, and to learn and to grow and to progress. And so again, long term, I think all that wins out. Short term, in any point in history, short term, it doesn't. Right now, it doesn't look to me.
What about you?
Well, as usual, I'm moved by what Yaron says, and I hear scripture, and the source for Yaron's hope is the book of Exodus, which is the first place in human history where we are presented with the possibility that an enslaved people that's being persecuted and murdered and living under the worst possible regime can free itself and have a shot at a life of independence and worth. And it's another inherited Jewish idea in the tradition. The way that we express this is by saying that there is a God who judges. The Israelites in Egypt were enslaved for hundreds of years, according to the Exodus story, hundreds of years before God wakes up and hears them. And he doesn't do anything until Moses kills the oppressor and goes out into the desert. So I think it's pretty realistic that there's a God, that God judges and acts, but probably often not for a very, very long time, and not until there's a human being who gets up and says enough. I know that today people don't want to read the Bible; they don't like reading the Bible, but I always hear this cry of the prophet.
How are you?
Who saw his nation destroyed.
I'm amazing, big dog.
People exiled. And in God's name, he says, "Is not my word like fire, like the hammer that shatters rock?" Hammer that my word is like fire, like the hammer that shatters rock. And this is the traditional way of saying something like what Yaron is saying, that it may take a long, long time, but there is a truth, and it has its own strength, and it will, in the end, shatter the things that are opposing it. That's our traditional hope. We and so I do have hope. I see the trends. The trends are terrible right now, and it's frightening and it's hard. But we are terrible at seeing the future, and it is very possible that an unexpected turn of events is going to appear. Maybe soon, maybe much later. And, the possibility of a redemption is there.
Let me ask, given that long arc of history, given that you do study the Bible, what is the meaning of this whole thing? What's the meaning of life?
Wow, that's beautiful. I think that the meaning of life is in part what Yaron touches on when he says that productive work, labor, creativity is at the heart of what it is to be human. I just think that there are some more arenas, and maybe we even agree with a lot of them, and I on a lot of them. to be human is to inherit a world which is imperfect, terribly imperfect in many ways, and God created it that way. Created a world which is terribly lacking, and He created us with the ability to stand up and to say, I can change the direction of this. I can do something to change the direction of this. I can take the time and the abilities that are given to me to be a partner with God in creating the world. It's not going to stay the way it was before me. It'll be something different. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot, but that is the heart. That is the key. That is the meaningful life, is to be a partner with God in creating the world so that it is moving that much more in the right direction rather than
So nudge even if a little bit the direction of the world. Well, you're on. You've actually been talking the program about life quite a bit. So let me ask the same question, and I never tire you asking these questions. Well, what do you think is the meaning of this?
Well, I mean, I don't believe in God, so God doesn't play a role in my view of the meaning of life. I think the meaning of life is to live. I like to say to live with a capital L. It's to embrace it, and I agree with you in a sense. We're born into a world, and as human beings, one of the things that makes us very different than other animals is our capacity to change that world. We can actually go out there and change the world around us. We can change it materially through production, we can change it spiritually through changing the ideas of people. We can change the direction into which humanity works. We can create a little universe. I think part of the joy of creating a family is to create a little universe, right? We're creating a little world around us. Part of the joy. And there is joy in family, so I'll make it all about difficulty and hard work.
I agree.
But part of the idea of getting married is to create a little world in which you and your spouse are creating something that didn't exist before, and building something, building. But it's really to live. I mean, one of the things that I see and it saddens me is wasted lives. Is people who just cruise through life. They get bored in they get born in a particular place. They never challenge it. They never question. They just they live, die, and nothing really happened. Nothing really changed. They didn't produce. They didn't make anything of their life. And produce here again in the largest sense. So to me, it's and every aspect of it. As you know, because you've listened to my show, I love art. I love aesthetics. I love the experience of great art. I love relationships. I love producing. I like business. I like that aspect of it. And I think people are shallow in so many parts of their lives, which saddens me. I mean, if you had 8 billion people on this planet, even if we just stayed at 8 billion, but the 8 billion all lived fully. Wow. I mean, what an amazing place this would be. What an amazing experience we would have. So to me, that is the meaning, is just make the most of get a short period of time on it. And it's it. This is it. And live it, experience it fully, and challenge yourself, push yourself. And let me just say something about optimism. One source of hope for me in the world in which we live right now is that there are people who do that, at least in certain realms of their lives, right? And I'm inspired, and I know a lot of people don't like me for this, but I'm inspired, for example, by Silicon Valley. In spite of all the political disagreements I have with them and all of that, I'm inspired by people inventing new technologies and building. I'm inspired by the people you talk to about artificial intelligence, about new ideas, about pushing the boundaries of science. Those things are exciting, and it's terrific to see a world that I think generally is in decline. Yet there are these pockets in which people are still creating new ventures and new ideas and new things. That inspires me to give me hope that is not dead. That in spite of the decay that's in our culture, there's still pockets where that spirit of human is still alive.
Yeah, they inspire me as well. Yeah, and they truly live with the capital L, and maybe I can doing a star. Maybe we can also put a little bit of love with the capital L up there as well. You're on. You knew I would end it that way, wouldn't you? You're on. You're on. Thank you so much. This is a huge honor. I really enjoyed the debate yesterday. I really enjoyed the conversation today that you spent. Your valuable time with me. It just means a lot. Thank you so much. This is amazing. Thanks for listening to this conversation with Yaron Book and Yaron today. Support this podcast. Please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me read you some words of Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time. The following is a conversation with Brian Keaton, experimental physicist at USASD, and author of Losing This Nobel Prize and Interviewing Possible. Plus, he's a host of the amazing podcast with the same name called Interviewing Possible. This is the Let's Listen podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors description. And now, here's my conversation with Brian Keating. As an experimental physicist, what do you think is the most amazing or maybe the coolest measurement device you've ever worked with or humans have ever built? Maybe for now, let's exclude the background imaging of cosmic extragalactic polarization instruments.
Yeah, I'm slightly biased towards that
Yes.
particular instrument, but
Talk about that in a little bit.
yeah, but certainly the telescope to me is a lever that has literally moved the Earth throughout history.
The OG telescope.
The OG telescope, yeah, the one invented not by Galileo, as most people think, but by this guy Hans Lippershey in the Netherlands. And it's kind of interesting because in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, there was the beginning of movable type. And so people for the first time in history had a standard by which they could appraise their eyesight. So looking at a printed word now, we just take it for granted, 12-point font, whatever, and that's what the eye charts are based on, this type. But back then, there was no way to adjust your eyesight if you didn't have perfect vision. And there was no way to even tell if you have perfect vision or not until the Bible and the movable type. And at that time, people realized, hey, wait, I can't read this. And my priest and my friend over here, he can read it. I can't read it. What's going on? And that's when these people in Venice or in the Netherlands saw that they could take this kind of glass material and hold it up and maybe put another piece of glass material, and it would make it true. And what was so interesting was nobody thought to take that exact same device, two lenses, and go like, let me go like this and look at that bright thing in the sky over there until Galileo. So Galileo didn't invent it, but he did something kind of amazing. He improved on it by a factor of 10. So he 10x'd it, which is almost as if he's going from 0 to 1 as going from 1 to 10. And when he did that, he really transformed both how we look at it, but also who we are as a species, because we're using tools not to get food faster or to preserve our legacy for future generations, but actually to increase the benefit of the
Somebody mentioned this idea that if humans weren't able to see the stars, maybe there was some kind of makeup of the atmosphere which for the early humans made it possible to see the stars, that we would never develop human civilization. It is raising the question of how important is it to look up to the sky and wonder what's out there, as opposed to maybe this over-romanticized notion, but like looking at the ground, it feels like a little bit too much focused on survival, not being eaten by a bear/lion. If you look up to the stars, you start to wonder what's not supposed to mean. You think that's modern humans romanticize
a little, because they also
right?
they look at the same two lenses and they look in there. Right? They look at bacteria, they look at hairs, and other things. And we're still doing. And so, to have a telescope serves a dual purpose. It's not only a way of looking out, it's looking in, but it's also looking back at time. In other words, inside microscope, you don't think, oh, I'm seeing this thing as it was a nanosecond ago, like travels 1/5 of a nanosecond. I'm seeing it in that. No, you don't think about it. But when you see something that's happening, on Jupiter, the Moon, Andromeda Galaxy, you're seeing things, back when Lucy was walking around the Serengeti Plain. And for that, I think that took then the knowledge of relativity and time travel and so forth. It took that before we could really say, oh, we really unlocked some cheat codes in the human brain. So I think that might be a little too much, but nevertheless, I mean, what's better than having a time machine? It's like we can look back into it, see things as they were, not as they are, and that allows us to do anything, including speculating about that. But one of the coolest things, I don't know if you're familiar with, I'm on radio stuff. I don't actually look at telescopes very often, except on rare occasions when I take one out to show the kids. But a radio telescope is even more sort of visceral. I mean, it's much less cool because you look at it and you're like, all right, it looks cool. It's kind of a weird shaped thing. Looks like it belongs in sci-fi. It's going to blast the Death Star or whatever. But when you realize that when you point a radio telescope at a distant object, if that object fills up the beam, which is basically the field of view of a radio telescope, it's called the beam. If you fill up the beam and you put a resistor, it's a simple absorbing piece of material, at the focus of the radio telescope, that resistor will come to the exact same temperature as the object is using. Which is pretty amazing. It means you're actually remotely measuring. You're taking the temperature of Jupiter or whatever in effect. And so it's allowing you to basically telescope. And there's no other science that you can really do that, right? If you're an archaeologist, let me get into my time machine and go back and see what was Lucy really like. It's not possible.
So the same thing happens. This is where I learned about this from Mark to the Penguins. When the penguins huddle together, they the body temperature arrives in the same place. So you're doing this remotely. The Mark to the Penguins, but remote.
Do it from Antarctica too.
Okay, excellent. You mentioned time machine. I think in your book, you even know about Prize. You talk about time machine. So let me ask you the question of take us back in time. What happened at the beginning of our universe?
Usually, preface it by saying I have a simple question. So, what happened before the universe began?
Trying to about time. I have a simple question for you. Let's just take two. I have a simple question. What happened at the beginning of our universe? There you go.
All right, good. So when we think about what's going to happen, it's more correct, it's more logical, it's more practical to go back in time, starting from the beginning. So if you go back 13.874 billion years from today, that's some day, right? I mean, you could translate it some day, right? So on that day, something happened. Earlier than the moment exactly next to the 1 o'clock. So at some point during that day, the universe starts to become a fusion reaction. It starts to fuse light elements and isotopes into heavier elements and isotopes into heavier. After that period of time, going forward back closer to today, less 10 minutes earlier, 10 minutes earlier, later around the temperature, let's say, we know more and more about what the universe is like. And in fact, all the hydrogen, it's a very good approximation in the water molecules in this bottle, almost all was produced during that first 20 minutes. So I would say, the actual fusion and production of the lightest elements in the periodic table occurred in a time period shorter than the TV show, The Big Bang Theory. Well done. Most of those light elements, besides hydrogen, aren't really used in encounter. You don't encounter helium that often unless you you don't need helium, hopefully. But other than that, those are the kind of things that are produced during that moment. The question became, how did the heavier things, like iron, carbon, nickel, we can get to that later, and I've brought some samples for us to discuss and how those came from a very different type of process, different type of fusion reactor, and a different type of process explosion as well called the fusion. However, if you go back to beyond those first 3 minutes, we really have to stay on this because we are not capable, in other words, going backward from the first 3 minutes of Stephen Weinberg book. We actually are to the point where ignorance takes over. In other words, we can't speculate on what happened 3 minutes before the preponderance of hydrogen was found in the universe. We just don't know enough about that method. There are many people, most practicing card-carrying cosmologists believe the universe began in what's called a singularity. And we could certainly talk about that. However, singularity is so far removed from anything we can ever hope to prove, hope to confront, or hope to observe with evidence. And it really only occurs in two instantiations, the Big Bang and the core of the black hole, neither of which is observable. And so for that reason, there are now flourishing alternatives. Let's say you can actually, for the first time, ask the question, that day, Tuesday, in the first moments of our universe, there was a Tuesday a week before that, 24 hours, 7 days before that. That has a perfectly well understood meaning in models of cosmology promoted by some of the more eminent of cosmologists working today. When I was in grad school over 25 years ago, no one really considered anything besides that Big Bang, that there was a singularity. And people would have to say, as I said, we just don't know. But they would say it's a future incarnation of some experiment will tell us the answer. But now there's people that are saying there is an alternative to the Big Bang. And it's not really fringe science as it once was 50, 80 years ago when these models were set. By the way, the first cosmology in history was not a singular universe. The first cosmology in history goes back to Akhenaten Ra and the temples of Egypt in the 3rd millennium BC. And in that, they talk about cyclical universes. So I always joke, that guy Akhenaten's court, he'd have a pretty high patient sort of now, because people have been using that cyclical model, the Penrose, the Paul Steinhardt, Aegis, and right up until this very moment.
Can you maybe explore the possible alternatives to the Big Bang theory?
So there are many alternatives, starting with the singularity, quantum, cosmologically demanding singular origin of the universe. That stands in contrast to these other models, in which time does not have a beginning. And many of them feature cycles, at least one cycle, possibly infinite number of cycles, called by Sir Roger Penrose, and they all have things in common, these alternatives, as does the dominant paradigm of cosmogenesis, which is inflation. Inflation is sort of, can be thought of as this spark that ignites the hot Big Bang that I said we understood. So it's an earlier condition, but it's still not an initial condition. In physics, I'll show you a grandfather clock, pendulum, swinging back and forth. You look away for a second, you come into the room, pendulum swinging back and forth. Alex, tell me, where does it start? How many cycles is it going to take before it gets? You can't answer that question without knowing the initial condition. In a very simple system, like a one-dimensional simple harmonic oscillator, think about understanding the whole universe without understanding the initial condition. It's a tremendous gap that we have as scientists that we may not be able to, in inflationary cosmology, determine the quantitative physical properties of the universe prior to what's called the inflationary epoch.
So you're saying for the pendulum in that epoch you can't, because you can infer things about the pendulum before you show up to the room in our current epoch, correct?
Right. Yeah, so if you look at it right now, but if I said, well, when will it stop oscillating? So that depends on how much energy it got initially, and you can measure its dissipation, its air resistance, the infrared camera, if it's getting hotter maybe, and you could do some calculations. But to know the two things in physics to solve that partial differential equation are the initial conditions and the boundary conditions. Boundary conditions here on Earth has gravitational field, it's not going to stirs, or you can make excursions, wildly down the pendulum. It's not, it has simple properties. So this is like, in other words, you can't tell me, when did the solar system start orbiting in the way that it does now? In other words, when did the moon acquire the exact angular momentum that it has now? Now, that's a pretty traditional example, but what I'm telling you is that the inflationary epoch supports and is successful at providing a lot of explanations for how the universe evolved after inflation took place, but it says nothing about how it itself took place. And that's really what you're asking. I mean, you don't really look what you care about, like Big Bang, the synthesis and the elements got made, and the fusion reactors, and the whole universe was a fusion reactor. But don't you really care about what happened at the beginning of time, at the first moment? And the problem is, we can't really answer that in the context of the Big Bang. We can answer that in the context of these alternatives. So you have to do that to the alternatives. One is aeon theory, the cyclic cosmology of certain. Another one was really popular in the 60s and 70s until the discovery of the primary component of my research field, the cosmic memory background radiation. We kind of spelled the death knell in some sense to what was called the quasi-steady state. Um, and then there was another model that kind of came out of that. You hear the word quasi, so it's not steady state. Steady state has always existed, as it has knowledge of Einstein, believed in Hubble showed evidence of the expansion of the universe. And most scientists believed in that for millennia, basically. We were eternal static. You couldn't believe that after Hubble, so they had to append onto it, concatenate this new feature that steady, it was quasi-steady. So the universe was making a certain amount of hydrogen every century in a given volume of space. And that amount of hydrogen that was produced was constant. But because it was producing more and more every century, centuries pile up, and the million piles up, the universe could expand. And so that's how they developed slowly, very slowly. And it doesn't match observation. So but that is I would have assumed that he thought it was infinite because there was really, if something had no beginning in common, we wouldn't likely doing the center of it, it's bounded or it has, in that case, a finite edge to it. I wonder what he thought about it. There are only two things that are infinite: the universe, human stupidity, and I'm not sure about the universe.
Well, me saying I'm not aware of the joke is a good example of the joke. It's very meta. Okay, so you were saying about quasi, all the alternatives of quasi state.
And the most kind of promising, although I hate to say that, people say, what's your favorite alternative, right?
This is not inflation, this is right.
Inflation is not transitory, it is quasi-alternative. So a very common
inflation joke, we were talking about cosmic inflation, so calm down on cryptocurrency inflation.
Although the first Nobel Prize, and one of the first Nobel Prizes in economics was awarded for inflation, not cosmology. So most people don't know. Inflation's already won it.
It's a good topic to work on if you want a Nobel Prize. But it doesn't matter.
Exactly, it's time translation. So when we look at the alternative that's called the bouncing or cyclic cosmologies, these have serious virtues, according to some. One of the virtues to me, just as a human, I'm speaking as a human, one of the founders of the new version of the cyclic cosmology called the bouncing cosmology is Paul Steinhardt. He's the Einstein Professor of Natural Sciences at Princeton University. You've heard of it. And he was one of the originators of what was called new inflation. In other words, he was one of the founding fathers of inflation, who now not only has no belief or support for inflation, he actively claims that inflation is baroque, pernicious, dangerous, malevolent, not to science, not just to cosmology, but to society. So here's a man who created a theory that's captivated the world of universe of cosmologists, such as it is. It's not a huge universe, but they're more podcasters than cosmologists. But this man created this theory with cosmologists, and now I joke, I'm like, Paul, you're denying paternity. You're like a deadbeat dad. Now you're saying like inflation is bogus. But he doesn't just attack. See, this is what's very important about approaching things as an experimentalist. You got a lot of theorists on, and that's wonderful. I think that's a huge service. An experimentalist has to say no. He or she has to be confident to say, like, I don't care if I prove you right or prove your enemy wrong or whatever. We have to be like exterminators, and nobody likes the exterminator until they need one, right? Or garbage collectors, right? But it's vital that we be completely kind of unpersuaded by the beauty and the magnificence and the symmetry and the simplicity of some idea. Like inflation is a beautiful idea, but it also has consequences. And what Paul claims, and I don't agree with him fully on this point, is that those consequences are dangerous because they lead to things like the multiverse, which is outside the purview of science. And in that sense, I can see support for what he does, but none of that detracts from my respect for a man. Imagine Elon comes up with this like really great idea, space, and then he's like, oh, actually, it's not going to work. But like, here's this better idea. And he's like, SpaceX is not going to work, but he's now created an alternative to it. It's extremely hard to do what Paul has done. Doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean I'm going to have more and more attention paid to it because he's my friend or because I respect the idea or I respect the man. and his colleague, and he just works really hard with him. But nevertheless, this has certain attractions to it. And what it does most and foremost is that it removes the quantum gravity aspect from cosmology. So it takes away 50% of the motivation for a theory of quantum gravity. You talked a lot about quantum gravity. You talked to people and people on the show. Always latent in those conversations is sort of the teleological expectation that there is a theory of everything. There is a theory of quantum gravity, but there's no law that says we have to have a theory of quantum gravity.
So that kind of implicit expectation has to do ultimately with the inflationary theory, so in cosmic inflation. So is that at the core? So, okay, maybe you can speak to what is the negative impacts on society from believing in cosmic inflation.
So, one of the more kind of robust predictions of inflation, according to its other two patriarchs, considered to be its patriarchs, Alan Guth at MIT and Andre Linde at Stanford. He was in the USSR, those ideas. Along with Paul Steinhardt, was that the universe has to eventually get into a quantum state. It has to exist in Hilbert space, and Hilbert space has certain features, and those features are quantum mechanical, endowed with quantum mechanical properties. And then it becomes very difficult to turn inflation off. So inflation can get started, but then it's like one of SpaceX rockets. It's hard to turn off a solid rocket booster, right? It continues thrusting in. You need another mechanism to douse the flames of the inflationary expansion, which means that if inflation kicks off somewhere, it will kick off potentially everywhere at all times, including now, spawning an ever-increasing set of universes. Some will die stillborn, some will continue and flourish, and this is known as the multiverse paradigm. It's a seemingly robust consequence not only of inflationary cosmology, but more and more we're seeing it in string theory as well. So that, sometimes two branches coming to the same conclusion is taken as evidence for its reality.
So one of the negative consequences is it creates phenomena that we can't, that are outside the reach of experimental science?
Yeah.
Or is it that the multiverse somehow has a philosophical negative effect on humanity? Like it makes us, maybe it makes life seem more meaningless? Is that where he's getting at a little bit, or is it not reaching that far?
Well, no, I think those are both kind of perceptive. The answer is a little both, because in one sense, it's meant kind of to explain this tuning problem that we find ourselves in a universe that's particularly façoned, that has features consistent with our existence, and how could we be otherwise? The sort of leak out. On the other hand, a theory that predicts everything, literally everything, can be said to predict nothing. Like if I say, Lex, you've been working out, you look like you look like you're about somewhere under 10,000 kilograms. Like, all right, yeah, you're right. That's hard to precise.
Welcome. How are you?
Reduction in entropy. Reduction.
Living the dream. Just watching some.
Exactly how much you. So me telling you that.
Lex Friedman. How about you?
In this case, it's basically saying that we're living in a because dictate. Yes, there has to be. The problem is. The manifestation.
That's nice of you.
So humans, and I'm sure you
Very
know, with AI and
sick, man.
and everything else, that humans, really are the only entities. So very.
That sounds amazing. Very nice.
Or the number of real numbers, or if I say let's figure the number of real numbers and rational, they're all different classifications. Infinities.
All right. Well, I'm working on a project right now, so apologies if anything. Just watch the podcast, my friend.
Right. So, but the human brain can contemplate infinity. They say in the singularity, the universe had an infinite temperature.
Some physicists.
So, let me ask you a question: is there anything that you can contemplate in the Einstein's little quip that's infinite, like a physical property, density property?
Dog, I'm working on this. I'm not close to the microphone. Apologies.
Let's go from from Infinity? How did it cool down? How did it get more and more tenuous and rarefied? So now it's only Infinity over 2 in terms of
Less
Pascal.
infinite, more infinite. Yeah, I mean, it's that's one of the biggest troubling things to me about infinity is we can't truly hold it inside our bodies. It's a mathematical construct that doesn't. It feels like the two are use it nonchalantly and
Yeah.
use their incredible machines, and then they'll
Well,
play
it
with this
works.
infinity as if they can level of math. You know, go to the same
Welcome, Miss Aquarius.
won't be a situation. But then
All right, you ready for me? Okie doke. Neil, if you want to play, we play game before we go to bed every night, and it is called the Plato app, Plato. It's on the App Store and Google. Feel free to download it if you'd like. It is on our phone, so Miss Aquarius, how was your day? It was lovely, thank you. Neil, you were correct. She would be. Good. That looked perfect. That looked and right down the middle. That I don't like that. All right, I got this one. There we go. That's good. You rode your motorcycle. Very, very cool. Wow, she's tough. She's been practicing. Oh, again. Get it. Excellent. Had you repaired a motorcycle? How long did it take to fix up? Very cool. How often do you ride? Very well. Miss Aquarius, that looks good. Ooh. What? Yeah, I can see that. Do you wear a helmet? Good. Serious. I catch you. Thank you, man. Yes, ma'am. Get it. Get it. Ooh. Good. X. Sweet juice, Miss Aquarius. Take care.
Yeah, all of that intuition fails
Yeah.
completely.
And I mean, how do you represent it in a computer, right? It's either some placeholder for infinity, or it's one divided by the smallest possible, real number that you can represent.
Well, that's basically my undergraduate study in computer science is how to represent a floating point in a computer. I think I took 17 courses. It's very easy.
I came to the right place. But in terms of what a physicist will mean, you're right. I mean, physicists will blithely, nonchalantly subtract infinity, renormalization, and do things to get finite answers, and it's miraculous. But at a certain point, you have to ask, well, what are the consequences for the real world? So one of them, you ask, what's the problem? Does it make us more meaningless? They purport, and many of the people that support it, like Andre Linde. In fact, Andre Linde says, you have a bias, you Lex, me Brian, you have a bias that you believe in a universe, but shouldn't you believe in a multiverse? What evidence do you have that there's not? So he turns it around. Whereas Paul Steinhardt will say, no, if anything could happen, then there's no predictive power within the theory. Because, well, this value of the inflationary field did not produce sufficient gravitational energy for us to detect it. Didn't happen.
Yo, dog, what's up?
100% correct, but it's like kind of chewing, You know.
Yep.
That's the
Wonder Bread / flag.
right. Would you like a piece of
Yeah.
bread?
By the way, even that word "liv," which means bread in Russian, like you were jokingly saying it now, it made me remember how much I
Yep.
loved bread when I was in the Soviet Union. And you were like hungry. That was the things you dreamed about. I don't know.
You know how do so we understand today? And they were completely in hiding. Like,
Okay. We're originally from Germany. We're originally from Frankfurt,
to
Germany.
get approved by the Communist Party to get approved, and then only then. No, like Jewish scientists, you had a passport. I said Jew on your passport. The famous Yaakov Borisovich, he was the advisor, one of my advisors, Alexander Polarev, and he had to only because he was and was one of the fathers of the Soviet atomic bomb club. He even get his Jewish student. He was by virtue of intellectual.
There's 3,000 of us in the United States alone, and thousands of us around the world. That's a very small contingent of my family.
Academia, and it's like, oh, well, what kind of? We have no idea of how. Like inflation, completely.
I just said there are thousands of us. What do you mean there aren't many of us?
People like Stephen Hawking until he was dead. Worth of heroism, especially in cosmology. There's so many they're working on office stuff for the atomic.
Same time, interesting incentives in the Soviet system. For a brief moment, because there's a dictatorship of the history of the 20th century for the Soviet Union, science was prioritized, and because the state prioritized the propaganda machines and the news and so on, it actually was really cool to be a scientist. Like you were highly valued in society. Maybe that's a better way to say it. And I would say you're saying like we have it easy now. In that sense, it was beneficial to be a scientist.
Hero of the Soviet.
Okay.
And that, there's positives to that. I mean, I'm not saying I would take the negatives or the positives, but it is interesting to see a world in which science is in a capitalist system, or maybe not capitalist, let's just say it, system. The celebrities, the athletes, the actors and actresses, the business leaders, musicians, the people with years and lawyers.
Right.
So
California.
It's interesting to think of a world where science is highly prized, but they had to do science within the constraints of always having watching.
The same in Germany. I mean, one of the most famous tragic cases, Haber, when that did the Haber-Bosch process allowed us to. Yeah, you look. I mean, you're getting fast every day, and you do that. I said Cleb, and you got so.
What'd you say?
It says and I look slim.
Yeah.
You got your swipe left. Right? I don't know. What it created the fertilizer we all enjoy and we eat from every. A German nationalist first. During trench war battles, had a whole cadre of that would go and witness these atrocities. But that was also they were almost putting that he would later be suppressed, and actually relatives would die in Auschwitz because of the chemical that he invented, also called Zyklon B. And so it's just unbelievable. So I feel like that does have resonance today in this worship of science. And listen to science, follow the science, which is more like scientism. And there is still a danger. I always say, just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you don't have a religion. Just because you in my case, my books, I talk a lot about the Nobel Prize. It's kind of like a kosher idol. It's, you can worship, it doesn't do any harm, and we want those people that are so significant in their intellectual accomplishments, because there is a core of America and the Western world in general that does worship and really look at science, predominantly because it gives us technology. But there's something really cool about that. And so for me, it's hard to find that balance point between looking at wisdom that it has, they're two different words, how much good and transformative power.
Yeah, but as I said previously, not right now. I'm working on a project, my friend.
You open so many doors. You also bring up our
Robots.
in that book. There's a lot of elements of religiosity to science, to the Nobel Prize.
I build robots, and
and
making a
I'll return to. But now, since the book, wow,
No,
intended,
it's quite complicated.
Nobel Prize. Can you tell me the story of Bicep,
Really?
the background, extragalactic polarization?
Really careful. Timing's really
Then maybe you can
important.
talk about Bicep too. But the thing that you cover,
Like consistency is really important on your device.
Yeah, that book is in contradiction to the second book. That's like a memoir. It's really
Like basically, you have to ensure that you're programming it consistently in the same places every time. If you don't do that, then it's not going to work.
To really feel like it is all consuming.
No, I don't do it for make money.
Now, because I have too many other, wonderful, delightful demands on my time. That moment when I was first captured
Yeah, I mean, you
by
can.
the sky as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, and together wanting to approach the greatest mystery, existence or non-existence of God. So
You're definitely right.
In other words, I do things that religious people do, and I don't do things that this conversation, my first podcast guest, actually, I shouldn't say. Nice. My first name drop. It's going to be comments about
Brian, the host of this week, greatest scientist in history of science, physicist, especially in the history of science.
So when I talked to Freeman, I said, Freeman, you call yourself an agnostic too. Can you tell me something like what do you do on Sundays? You go to church. Like, no, I don't go to church. And I'm like, well, imagine there was like an intelligent kid, and he was looking down, or she, I don't know, thing was looking down, and saw Freeman. And on Sundays, like, people go to church, but Freeman doesn't go to church. And then there's another group of people that don't go to church, and those are called atheists. But Freeman calls himself an agnostic, but he does the things that like Richard Dawkins. But he doesn't go to the same church that Richard Dawkins doesn't go to. Right? So I said, how would you distinguish yourself if not in practice? Well, I'm a behaviorist. I believe you can change your mentality. You can influence your mind through your bodily, physical action. So when I was a 12-year-old, I got a telescope. I was actually an altar in the Catholic Church, which is kind of strange. These we get into.
Sure, absolutely. I've got a section of this Discord. It says "Ask Rabbi anything." Ask any question that you want, and when I have time, I will certainly answer it for you.
Young Brian, born to two Jewish parents. My father was a professor, and my etc. We go to. I always joke. We go to. Typical 2 days. And we have. That's not it. For years, my mother remarried, and named Ray Keating. My father's.
Again, I'm willing to answer any question that you have. So, right there in that section, Ask Rabbi anything, I will answer any question that you have. Feel free to ask away.
They did Christmas.
You're
Easter,
fine. Just ask
one of
any
the most
question that you
wonderful
have there, my
experiences I
friend.
had, and I do things with great gusto. Whatever I do, I want to take it all. So to me, that meant, in this case, Catholicism. And I said, I want to go all the way. I became an altar boy in the Catholic Church. I had like serious skills, like collection basket, people, too. But in this case, I was 13. I don't know if you remember, when you were 13, but if you extrapolate the next level up, it's like the next level up from confirmation, altar boy, is priest. I don't know if you're aware of this, but priest.
Take care, Neil. Come back anytime, but ask any question that you have in that Ask Rabbi Anything. If you have any questions, I'll answer.
I found it.
That up.
It's literally the section right above this VC.
In that feature. And instead, when I should have been preparing for my bar mitzvah, as most Jewish boys,
You're welcome, Big Dog.
And infatuated with all the things you can see with it. Nothing bigger than that one over there that your hedgehog's looking through. Is that hedgehog?
It's a hedgehog. I should go one by one.
Oh, you can't. Let's see here. Let's fix
Here's
that.
a good place to ask about the telescope that put some clamps on.
All right.
And using.
Now you're officially an astrophysicist.
Why experimentalist versus an
Preach
engineer?
for
If you assemble this
anything.
telescope, you give it a mount.
Why doesn't he have permission?
Yeah, but there's no experiment.
Channel permission.
For show.
Everyone.
It's very shallow. So experimenters take
View
it to the
channel,
next
manage
level
channel,
and actually
manage
achieving
permission.
something. Here, I just built a thing for
Create
show.
Well, that's always
send
interesting. Oh, you're an
messages.
experimental cosmologist. And I build a lot of universes. Most of my time is putting clamps on things, soldering things. It's not actually doing the stroking of my non-existent beard, contemplating the cyclic versus the bouncing cosmological.
Yeah, and just like most of robotics,
Send
it's just using
messages.
Velcro for things.
Right.
Allows members
It's
to
not
send
like having
messages in
dancing
this
dogs
channel.
or whatever. So telescope.
Yes, this telescope. What's the story of this little
So
telescope?
this telescope's a very precious thing. In some ways, it's a symbol of what got me into, what brought me all the blessings I have in my life. Came from a telescope. And I always advise parents, or even people for themselves, you right here, wherever we are, in biggest city on earth, Manhattan, where I was growing up as a 12-year-old outside of Manhattan. You can see the exact same craters on the moon, the same rings of Saturn, the same moons of Jupiter, the same phases of Venus. You can see the Andromeda Galaxy, that's 2.5 million light years away from Earth. You could do that with that little thing. One that's a little more expensive. Get one that has a mount, and you could attach now your smartphone. What the hell is that? I wouldn't have known what that was in 1984. And with that, you can do something that no other science, to my knowledge, can really replicate. Maybe biology in some sense, but you can experience the physical sensation that Galileo experienced when he turned a telescope like that to Jupiter and saw these 4 dots over there. Or that Saturn had ears, as he called it. Or that the moon was not crystalline, polished, smooth, and made of this heavenly substance, quintessent substance, right? So where else can you be viscerally connected with the first person to ever make that discovery? Try doing that with the Higgs boson. Get yourself an LHC and smash together, high luminosity, call up Harry Cliff, and say, I want to replicate, how did you feel? He didn't feel anything. None of them felt anything. It took years to compile it. You can't do it. Well, this, you can feel the exact same emotions.
That's fascinating. It's almost like maybe there's another one like that is fire.
Yes.
Like when you build a bonfire, like you actually get it. See, if you use a lighter, I think if you actually, by rubbing sticks together or however you do it without any of the modern tools, that's probably what that's like.
Yeah.
And then you get to experience the magic of it, of what like early humans, Homo sapiens,
feel what Og felt.
By the way, is this a gift?
This is the gift.
Yeah, is this
You need a little bit of a swag upgrade. So
But yeah, this is I'm pulling a boot. Like, ask if this is a gift, making it very uncomfortable for you. Not really. This is
actually my childhood telescope here.
But now, all right.
So looking for this telescope
was when your law science was first.
changed my life, because not only was I doing that, I was replicating what Galileo did, but I was. I'm 100% not comparing myself to Galileo. okay, if there's any confusion with it. But I did replicate exactly what he did. And I was like, holy crap, this is weird. Let me write it down. So it had another effect, which all good scientists, budding scientists should do, and all parents should do. Get your kid a book, a little notebook, take a pencil to it. Write down what you see, what you hypothesize, what you think it's going to be. Not like in the high school, hypothesis, thesis, but just like, wow, how did I feel? Better yet, astronomy is a visual science. Sketch what you see. The Lagoon Nebula, the Pleiades, Seven Sisters. You can see them anywhere on Earth. And when you do that, again, you're connecting two different hemispheres of your brain, as I understand it, and you're connecting them through your fingertips. You literally have the knowledge in your fingertips, in your connection between what you see, what you observe, and what you write down. Then you do research, right? The goal of science is not to just replicate what other people did, it's do something new. And that's why we call it research, and not just like studying, Wikipedia. And in so doing, you start to train a kid at age 12 or 13 for $50. It's unbelievable. And now we can do even better. Share it on Instagram or whatever. And you can, by doing so, have an entree into the world of what does it really mean to be a scientist, and do so viscerally. I often say, I was taught this by my English teacher, Mrs. Tompkins, in ninth grade, that the word educate, it doesn't mean to pour into. Let me pour in some facts and facts. It's not like machine learning. You're showing like billions of cats, or you're not like forcing it in. You're bringing it out. It means to pour out of in Latin, educare. And what more could a teacher want than to have something the kid is just like gushing? No, you're not going to see that.
Inspire.
Yes.
Inspire.
Yeah.
Shout out to Mrs. Tompkins.
Yeah, Mrs. Tompkins. She's watching. Yeah. She's a big fan. Me, she doesn't care for, but you.
Yeah, excellent. We take those we love for granted. This is in Manhattan.
This is in Westchester County.
Got it. So, okay, so then that's where the dream is born.
Yeah.
But then there is the pragmatic journey of a scientist. So going to university, graduate school, postdoc, and all the way to where you are today. What's that? What are some notable moments in that journey?
So I call that the academic Hunger Games. Because it's like you're competing against like these people, who are just getting smarter all the time as you're getting smarter all the time. They want to get into a fewer and fewer number of slots. Like there's fewer slots to get into college than in high school. There's fewer slots in graduate school. There's very few slots to be a postdoc. Many, maybe infinitesimal number. We just did a faculty search at UC San Diego. 400 applicants for one position. It's almost getting impossible. Like I almost can't conceive of doing what these new brilliant people applying to become an assistant professor at a state university that they're doing. It takes so much courage to do that. So I went from this kid in New York thinking I would never be a professional astronomer, because I didn't know any, I'd never seen any, I didn't even know that they existed, and I thought, who the hell's going to pay me to look at the stars? Like, will they pay me to be like an ice cream taster? Like, it's just not something I could conceive of getting paid to do, even if I had the brilliance to do it, which I feel I did. And then I went to graduate school, and during graduate school, I had this kind of on again, off again relationship with my father. And I knew that he was a mathematician. He had left and got remarried himself and moved across the country. I didn't see him for 15 years. And in that time, I learned a lot about him. And I learned that he had gotten very interested, not in pure mathematics, which he had been a number theorist and contributed seminal work on the Diophantine equations, which play a role in Turing's work. But anyway, he had become interested, turned completely away from that into the foundations of quantum mechanics and relativity, which is physics. And by that time, I was at Brown University. And I was, thinking, maybe I'll be a condensed matter physicist or experimentalist. I never thought I'd be a theorist, and I'm a theorist, so it was pretty prescient. And but it always appealed to me, like, why not do what made me happy as a 12-year-old? Like, we often forget about like those, primitive things about us are probably the most sustainable, durable, and resilient attributes of our character. So with my own kids, I look like, what are they interested in now when they're young? And it doesn't mean that's what they're going to do. I mean, some of them want to play Fortnite, like professional Fortnite, which there are. But, the odds of that is less than the odds of being a professor.
Can I ask you, is your father still with us? No. Just in a small tangent, do you think about him? Does his mathematical journey reverberate through who you are?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, it did in very many ways. And he's been gone for a long time now. Thinking back to that time with him, he must have instilled some capacity for me to only want to spend my time, which is a limited quantity. I don't think it's the most limited quantity. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But to go into only the most challenging, interesting things with the limited time that we have while we're alive. And for him, it was the foundations of quantum mechanics. For me, it was the foundations of the universe and how did they come to be. And I felt like, well, people have been trying since Einstein to outdo Einstein, really had made great progress in the foundations of quantum mechanics. But this is an exciting time. The Kobe satellite had just released its data that the universe had this anisotropy pattern. Stephen Hawking called it like looking at the face of God and so forth. And so it seemed like this is a good golden age for what I'm going to do and what I'm most interested in. But always throughout that, I wanted to understand. I didn't want to be a wrench monkey. No offense to people that just do experiment.
And no offense to monkeys.
No offense to monkeys. That's right. Sorry, man. But thinking back to what animates me, it's not doing the engineering as much as it is getting the data. But there's a lot of steps. I want to be the guy understanding what made the universe produce the signal that we saw. So I always joke with my theorist friends, call me a closeted theorist. Like I want to be, what they call a guy who hangs out with musicians, a drummer. So I want to be like that for physics, right? Like for theoretical physics. I want to be like the guy who doesn't do new theory, but understands the theory that the new theorists are doing.
I love that formulation of a theorist is understanding the source of the signal you're getting. Like signal is primary. Like the thing you measure is primary, and theory is just the search of explaining how that signal originated. But it's all about the signal. I mean, I see the same search for the human mind and like neuroscience in that same kind of way. It's ultimately about the signal, but you kind of hope to understand how that signal originated. That's fascinating. That's such a beautiful way to explain experimental physics, because it ultimately at the end of the day is all about
Yeah, and maybe those two things, the neuroscience and the cosmos, not getting too romantic, but yeah, maybe they're linked in some fundamental way, some fundamental cosmic consciousness. But
we're gonna get to that.
Yeah, no, we definitely have to. But getting back, so my origins. So I always say, like, and I want to try this. You said you wouldn't answer any of my questions, but I'm going to ask this question. What's the most important day? Don't tell me the date, but to you, what's the most important day to you?
Do I have to answer or do I have to think about it?
No, answer. Like, you don't have to tell me the exact date of the calendar. It could be like your mistress's, birthday or whatever. But
I have so many of these track. Even though I'm single, how does that even make sense? Okay, I'm sorry. So a day, like a month and a day. Yeah, I mean, for me, it'll be December 31st.
Yeah. So I was gonna say New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. Some people say birthday, anniversary, kid's birth. They're usually signifying beginnings and ends. Right? January means the portal between the gods, is the portal between the beginning and the end. So you're looking back, maybe to Russian, the death side, the light side, looking forward into January, the beginning, right?